Hello, good evening. Welcome to the National Institute of Economic and Social Research for our third annual Prais lecture on productivity. I'm Jagjit Chadha, the director of the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, and I'm delighted this evening not only because we're able to hold another Prais lecture following two brilliantly successful ones in the past 2 years that involved Bart van Ark and David Sainsbury, that we are in the presence of Professor Sheila Ogilvie of All Souls College, Oxford, who's going to talk to us today about state capacity and economic growth, some cautionary tales in a Hilaire Belloc echo, I think, this evening. Absolutely delighted to welcome Sheila here today. She is the Churchill Professor of Economic History at All Souls College at the University of Oxford. And as a specialist in economic history, a fellow, as you would expect, for someone of her eminence of the British Academy and the Academy of Social Sciences, grew up a Canadian, but has also lived in Scotland, Germany, England, the US, and the Czech Republic. I've known her for many years, and I've looked forward to this particularly not only because she's such an economic historian, but she tackles incredibly interesting questions in an original and compelling manner, in the sense that she writes the kind of books you want to read even when you're not at work, if you see what I mean. And working as a researcher, I have to read a lot when I'm at work as well. And it's wonderful that she's been able to join us this evening. My only regret is that, this is another online event rather than us meeting in person. But we are unfortunately where we are. It's been a year and a half of great trouble facing many of us. And one sort of silver lining under the cloud of COVID is that many of us, and Sheila and others in the Institute, have managed to get on with our work in such a profound manner over the last year and a half. This evening, she'll tackle incredibly important questions often put to us is how important is state capacity for economic growth. And I think we've had a number of observations since the COVID crisis about the failures, relative failures or otherwise, or even absolute, of state capacity in handling events. And it's clear that, at least intuitively, it's an important part of the story. I look forward to hearing Sheila about it. Before we go on, let me remind everyone why we have this series. It's really to commemorate and remember the work of Sig Prais. Himself was born in Germany in 1928 and started working at the Institute in 1953. And his work on productivity is widely appreciated and understood. In fact, I was at a conference today at the Bank of England, organised by the Productivity Institute, the Bank, the MMF, the Money Macrofinance Society, and the National Institute, that was discussing many of the issues that Sig himself had raised throughout his long and productive career as a researcher on productivity. In fact, I think the best tribute I can pay is this very morning. I received an email about the parliamentary lecture that we hold every year, that this year was given by John Cruddas, MP, who's written a book on the dignity of work. And he's writing up his parliamentary lecture on post-war productivity. And I just want to read to you his final paragraph that I think more than anything reflects the work of SIG, both at the National Institute, but also its influence on the national agenda. And John writes, maybe we should try something different. Replace disease with the idea of a post-war dilemma, or replace miracle with the idea of post-war consolidation, replace puzzle with that of modern stagnation. Maybe it is time to rehabilitate some of the concerns of the Oxford School and industrial pluralism or stakeholding. For these are not abstract debates confined to the academy. They require an agile applied social science, very much reflected in the history of the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. Without wishing to be too melodramatic, the future of liberal democracy could depend on it, writes John Cruddas, and I thank him for that. But I think his mentions of Oxford, the work of SIG, and the work of the National Institute are no better tribute both to Sig Prais and to our speaker this evening, Sheila Ogilvie. Sheila, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Jagjit. Let me share my screen. And I hope that that is visible to everyone. If you can't see it, please shout. Fantastic. Well, thank you very much indeed for that extremely nice introduction. And it's a great honor for me to be here today giving the Prais lecture. I find the whole idea of what the Prais lecture is about incredibly interesting. And I was particularly pleased to have something to stimulate me to put together various thoughts that I've been having about state capacity, not just over the last few months, but actually probably over the last 30 years or so, working on the economic history, reaching back into the medieval period of some of the poorer parts of Europe, as well as some of the richer ones. Economic history is often seen, it's often seen as a sort of rear view mirror in guiding economic policy. And today what I'd like to do is to look at an idea, state capacity, which is both central to much development policy nowadays and is often supported by ideas from economic history. And what I will do today is that I will argue that we must go beyond a narrow mirror image to understand the full breadth of what lies behind us. And I think that economic history can help us to see what to avoid in state capacity as well as what to aim for. So as I mentioned already, state capacity there's been a sort of growth industry both in modern economics and in economic history in the last couple of decades, focusing on this concept of state capacity. And there's a widely held view now, I think, that state capacity is really important for economic growth. And this isn't something I'm going to be arguing against today, but I'm going to be suggesting that there are ways in which we need to understand it better and to use the rear view mirror of history in thinking about it in a more nuanced way. State capacity, in the most general sense, is defined as being the ability of a state to implement its aims, which might sound a bit like an like a sort of, truism, but I think the wisdom behind it is that it takes for granted that the state has a role to play in economic growth, and it focuses on its ability to perform this role. So it isn't about does the state have a role in economic growth, but how able is it to fulfill that role? And what I'd like to do today is to consider, first of all, how well we can measure state capacity. I want to ask the question whether having a lot of capacity implies that the state uses it to promote economic growth. And I want to specifically focus on the question of what economic history shows, since that is something which is not only something I know about, but it's also something which is used by modern economists to inform present-day policy, since economic growth is something that inherently has taken place over time. And so we have to look into the past to see what's been associated with successful growth in the past. And I'd like to actually start with what might seem to be a slightly nerdy question, which is how do we measure state capacity? And economists and economic historians have broken down state capacity into three subcategories, namely fiscal capacity, legal capacity, and bureaucratic capacity. But in terms of measurement, we've almost always measured it through fiscal capacity. And I think that's simply because fiscal capacity is something which generates numbers, whereas legal and bureaucratic capacity tends to use much more quantitative, much more institutional assessments. So fiscal capacity is by far our dominant measure of state capacity, and it too is defined in various ways. Probably the dominant way is by looking at state revenues as a percentage of GDP. Second way is looking at per capita revenue, state revenues as a percentage of the daily urban unskilled wage. So trying to look at it from the point of view of the, if you like, the unskilled average member of the economy. And sometimes economists measure it in terms of per capita state revenues in terms of absolute value, since that enables an assessment of how much heft, how much weight a particular state can exercise, for instance, in the international arena. And what we know as economic historians is that between about 1500 and about 1900, what we observe is that both rich economies and poor economies across the whole world saw a rise in fiscal capacity. That fiscal capacity grew earlier on average in rich societies, and that it was higher on average at all times in richer societies than in poor ones. And based on these general average facts covering the key period during which both the state emerged as a modern entity and also economic growth took place, there's a growing literature which has used economic history to argue that there was a relationship between these two, that fiscal capacity and economic growth were related, and that there was a causal relationship between the two, so that fiscal capacity actually fueled economic growth. I want to show you a few graphs here just to give you a sense of what economic historians have been finding. As you can see from this graph, which shows tax revenues as a percentage of GDP in Western Europe compared to the middle and high income, less developed economies, and then also since 1900, other less developed economies, the lower income ones. You can see that over the past 500 years, fiscal capacity has risen greatly as a proportion of GDP, and it rose more and earlier in present-day rich economies than in poor economies. So that empirical regularity I was talking about a few minutes ago clearly seems to hold in this overall evaluation of fiscal capacity across the world for the last 510 years. If we look then inside the present-day rich economies, the more developed economies, they themselves actually varied hugely across this period. And here I'm just showing what happened to GDP per capita, our best estimates of economic growth over the 1500 to 1900 period. And you can see that the economies that are rich now, fairly rich now, varied a lot. So they were already quite different, even in 1500. And by 1900, they had become even more different. So there was a huge divergence in economic outcomes across the present-day rich economies over this 400-year period. The Netherlands and England, as you could see, the green and the red curves on the graph were the richest economies in Europe. But interestingly, they had very different growth paths. So England grew massively from about 1650 onwards and had the first industrial revolution, as we know, while although the Netherlands was the richest until 1800, it actually stagnated. Its economy stagnated from about 1600 to about 1820. And strangely, it only industrialized relatively late in the 19th century. And then you've got below the Netherlands and England, you've got France, Germany, and Spain, which are not really growing very much as far as their economies are concerned between 1500 and 1800, at least as far as per capita GDP is concerned. And then you've got Poland and Russia as the poorest economies in Europe, only starting to grow after about 1800, and even then growing only rather slowly and only a little bit. So this is the outcome variable, the GDP per capita. What's going on with fiscal capacity during this period? Well, here's a graph showing tax revenues as a percentage of GDP, are the most widely used fiscal capacity measure. And what you can see is that cross-country comparisons of fiscal capacity very roughly mirror that graph we were just looking at, showing per capita GDP. So you've got the Netherlands, the green curve. The Netherlands was the richest economy in Europe until 1800, and it also had the highest fiscal capacity. And you've got Poland at the bottom as the poorest economy in Europe, or one of the two poorest, and it had the lowest fiscal capacity. But in between, the correlation between per capita GDP and fiscal capacity is not actually that clear. France, Germany, and Russia saw rising fiscal capacity across this period, but low and stagnant per capita GDP, if you'll remember from the graph that we just looked at. So France, Germany, Russia, not really beginning to grow until the 19th century, but you actually see their fiscal capacity increasing long before the 19th century. England was the richest, or the second richest economy in Europe until 1800. It was rich and fast growing, but its fiscal capacity on this graph is actually quite similar to that of Germany and France. And then you've got the Netherlands, which is rich and slow growing, and it has higher fiscal capacity than rich and fast growing England. So you've got this rough association between economic growth and fiscal capacity, but it's only very rough. A number of you've got this at the very top and the very bottom of the spectrum, it looks as if the two are associated. And in the middle, there are other things going on. So I used a particular measure of fiscal capacity, you see a similar rough association between per capita GDP and the other main measures of fiscal capacity that are used. So tax revenues per capita as a proportion of the daily urban unskilled wage shows a very similar pattern. At the top and the bottom, there's a relationship with economic growth. In the middle, not so much. Similarly, even the absolute value of tax revenues per capita shows at the top and the bottom of the spectrum a clear relationship. In the middle, it's much more nuanced, it's much more jumbled. All you see is that on average, very rich economies have high fiscal capacity and very poor economies have low fiscal capacity. But there's a lot of interesting variation going on in the middle of the spectrum. And in particular, what you observe is that a number of quite poor and stagnant economies, 17th century France, for instance, 18th and 19th century Germany, and Russia, interestingly, in the 19th century, have very high and rising fiscal capacity. As already mentioned, the Netherlands had the highest fiscal capacity in Europe, but its economy actually stagnated from about 1670 to 1820, and it industrialized relatively late. It was only England that had both high fiscal capacity and rapid economic growth. Even if we had seen, of course, a clear association between the two, between economic growth and fiscal capacity, as we know, association doesn't imply causation. So taxes could be causing growth, as is argued by the fiscal capacity literature. Growth could be causing taxes to rise, taxation or public goods being a sort of normal good that richer people demand more of, or underlying variables could be causing both. There's a tendency, as development economists know, for good social outcomes to be correlated with one another. So we've got a very, very rough association, but I think the weight that's being placed on it in the state capacity literature is probably not wholly justified. Moving on from that, we need to consider whether fiscal capacity is actually a very good measure of state capacity. And on the face of it, it seems like it should be. Our reason to focus on fiscal capacity, after all, is to measure the resources that the state can spend on activities that might benefit the economy. Problem with that is that it needs to include all resources. And instead, our measures of fiscal capacity are based almost always on money tax revenues, so tax revenues levied in cash, and those that are raised by the central state. So it's monetized tax revenues raised by the central state. Now, that might seem sensible in modern terms, but actually it leaves out key components of state resources, not just historically, but also in modern developing economies. The use of conscripts and other forms of forced labor, of coerced labor for public works, which you see in a very, very widespread way in Prussia, in France, in Russia, and in China over the past 500 years. There's a considerable use by the state of non-money tributes in kind, for instance, particularly in the form of grain. There is a very important role still played by the net revenues which the state gets from the royal domains or from its own monopolies over particular products. The state earns a lot of money from selling privileges and monopolies, and that's actually something which my colleagues who work on modern Africa tell me is quite important for state capacity in Africa now. And there's the problem of taxes levied by lower levels of the state administration, not just by the center. To give you a sense of how important this could be, as late as 1880, more than half of Prussian state revenues were actually being raised by local government rather than by central government. So they're not actually going into the measures for state capacity. Or to give you another example, in 1789, the French state was using corvée labor so much for public works, particularly for road building, that it was yielding the equivalent of about 20 million livres in cash. So these are not quantitatively small components of public resources. And what this means, if you think about it, is that the fiscal capacity gap between rich and poor economies, that correlation that we were just looking at, which seems to suggest that high fiscal capacity is strongly associated with high and rising per capita GDP, and low fiscal capacity with poverty and slow growth. The fiscal capacity gap between rich and poor economies is poorly measured by just focusing on money tax revenues of the central state, rather than on total public resources. So this is one way in which economists working on present day less developed economies and economic historians working on the last 500 years of any economy actually need to up our game. Until we measure the whole set of resources which are collected by the state, I don't think we're actually measuring fiscal capacity. And hence, we're not really seeing what the fiscal or the state capacity gap is between rich and poor economies. Even if fiscal capacity were accurately measured, and you must have been thinking about this yourself by this time, the question arises, does it actually measure state capacity? Because the problem with a tax is that it's actually a cost. What we're interested in is what comes out of it. It doesn't tell us, looking at fiscal capacity doesn't tell us what the state actually does with its revenues. And the question arises, does having a lot of revenue imply that the state uses it to promote economic growth? Well, here's something where economic history can a little bit answer this question, but I think we need a lot more work on this. What we know about the structure of state expenditures in the past is a bit horrific, because historically, most state revenues, on the low end, 50% of state revenues, and on the high end, 90% of state revenues, were spent on war or on servicing war debts. A very, very small share of state expenditures were devoted to civilian purposes that I'm going to be talking about in a moment, such as the legal capacity or bureaucratic capacity or transportation infrastructure or industrial policy. Very, very small share. And almost nothing was devoted to the things which we actually think are the common interest goods, the public goods, which we want the state to be providing, things like education, welfare, famine relief. Almost nothing before the 19th century of these rising state revenues were actually allocated to the things that we think we want the state to be doing. What I'd like to do is to illustrate this. I'd like to look briefly at an unusually well-researched example, because I don't think we know as much as we would like to about state expenditures. But I'd like to look at a comparison between Britain and Spain during the period of the British Industrial Revolution, the second half of the 18th century, which was carried out by a Spanish historian of tax systems and war in 2007. And what you see from this is, starting out looking at Britain versus Spain, you see that Britain had higher and more rapidly growing per capita GDP, as you can see in the left-hand graph, and it had higher fiscal capacity than Spain, as you can see in the right-hand graph. Just to reassure you, Britain and Spain had a very similar population size, 9 or 10 million during this period. So Britain was richer than Spain, and from 1650 onwards grew much faster, while the Spanish economy stagnated. And then, as you can see on the right-hand side, Britain actually had much lower fiscal capacity than Spain until 1700, but then it really began to grow, and during the 18th century, it was higher. When you look at this, the period of the British Industrial Revolution between 1760 and 1800, you can see that British state expenditures were indeed much higher than Spanish ones in absolute terms. And remember, they're about the same size of country. And that might seem to support the idea that high state expenditures and faster economic growth go together. But interestingly, and this is why this particular study is so important, the Spanish state actually spent more than the British state on civilian purposes in this period. State expenditures on civilian purposes were not related to per capita GDP or either the level or the growth rate of per capita GDP. In rich, fast-growing Britain, less than 10% of state expenditures were devoted to civilian purposes, as you can see on the left-hand graph, and could thus, in principle, have benefited economic growth if they were devoted to civilian purposes. In poor and stagnant Spain, by contrast, about 33% of state spending was civilian across this period, and the total pound value, as you can see on the right-hand graph here, the total pound value was actually higher in Spain than in Britain, even though the Spanish economy, as we know, was poorer. So the fact that civilian state expenditures were higher in Spain than in Britain, even though the Spanish economy was much poorer, is quite striking. Question then arises, though, did this state spending on civilian purposes, which was much higher in Spain than in England, did it actually help growth? Well, no. The Spanish economy remained poor and stagnant until well past 1800. In fact, as late as 1900, per capita GDP in Spain lay much, much closer to Russia and Poland than it did to Britain. So you've got this, once you start breaking down state expenditure, you see that what we really want to be focusing on, of course, is civilian state expenditures. And there, the relationship with economic growth seems to break down completely. Now, obviously, we need to know much more about this. Further studies are needed, but this example of this unusually well-researched example between Britain and Spain certainly casts some question over the relationship between what the state actually does with its rising tax take and how that could have possibly affected the economy. Now, you might be saying, well, the fact that the British state spent 90% of its revenues on war, maybe war was good. Maybe, it was something which actually benefited the economy. And there's a very famous quotation from Tilley, one of the early historical political scientists who looked at the relationship between the growth of the state and the growth of taxes and the growth of war. And as he said, war made the state and the state made war. So it's been well recognized for 40 or 50 years that what pre-modern states did was that they fought wars. There was probably a great power war going on in 95% of the years between 1600 and 1815 in Europe. Can we somehow argue that fiscal capacity spent on war helped economic growth? Well, in a very basic way, there are ways in which war might at least defend an economy against predation from the capacity of other states. So that in that sense, keeping predation, keeping invasion out could be a sort of economically beneficial function of war. But remember, many wars were offensive. Remember that you have to defend yourself against an offensive war. Even if you're being defensive, many of the wars that the state spent this 50 to 90% of its fiscal resources on were offensive, and even defensive wars harmed economic growth. Just to give you a few examples, the 30 Years' War, which raged between 1618 and 1648 in Central and Eastern Central Europe. The part of Europe that I've particularly done a lot of research on is estimated to have killed 500,000 soldiers, and I put 4 million there as the number of civilians. The estimates actually range from 4 to 12 million civilians in Central Europe across this period. Regionally, anything between 20 and 60% of the population was killed, of the civilian population died during this war. And the German economy stagnated for 150 years after the war ended. Between 1760 and 1815, the European wars that took place in 3 out of the 5 years during that period blocked trade, they raised prices, they crowded out private investment. Britain is, it's been estimated, suffered greatly from this, and actually it's amazing that it industrialized. Britain industrialized despite, not because of the fact that it was at war for 3 out of 5 years during this period. And in a recent study by Kevin O'Rourke, what Kevin did was he looked at the French wars between 1793 and 1815 and saw and found that they not only damaged economic growth and market integration in France and in England, but they actually, you can see their impact in market integration across the world. On the other side of the world, you can see the impact of these wars between 1793 and 1815. So the idea that war benefited economic growth rests on very shaky foundations. So this thing, which state capacity spent 90% of its resources on, it's really difficult to argue that it benefited economic growth. Well, what did the state do? The state did spend, well, in Britain, it spent about 10% of its state expenditures were on civilian purposes. We saw in Spain, it was about 30%. So what did the state do on these civilian expenditures? Well, one of the things that we think the state can and should do is to provide transportation infrastructure, which may have natural monopoly characteristics, it may have public good characteristics, there may be market imperfections, which mean that it's difficult for private individuals trading in markets to actually think that it's worthwhile to set up major transportation infrastructure. And we also think, especially from the work of large research teams at the World Bank, that transportation infrastructure is actually good for economic growth. So what did pre-modern states between the 1500 and 1850, who were levying an increasingly large share of GDP as taxes, what did they do about transportation infrastructure? Well, looking at each different type of infrastructure in turn, it's rather a sad story. River improvements and canals were provided rather poorly by all states in Europe. The private sector was actually the entity that invested in and developed the canal network in Britain. It was only really the state in France who did it much less. As a consequence, by 1815, the density of waterways in Britain was about 3 times that in France. And in fact, by 1850, England and Wales were ahead of France, Spain, and Germany in terms of the kilometers of navigable waterways per square kilometer in the country. Only the Netherlands and Belgium had more waterway density than Britain did by 1850. Roads were also provided very poorly by all states up to the mid 19th century. In Britain, the source of the very dense network of roads that you begin to observe in the 18th century, the institutional source of them was actually private turnpike trusts. They were being provided by the market, possibly underprovided, but at least they were being provided. Between 1690 and 1815, these private toll roads added an estimated 1.65% to national income. And the contrast here again is often with France, where roads were provided by the state by levying that corvée labor I was mentioning a few slides ago. And corvée labor, as we all know, coerced labor, works slowly and reluctantly and shirks a lot and does bad work perfectly reasonably. If I were a forced laborer, that's how I behave. And the roads were provided extremely poorly in France. In 1760, French travel speed was about half that of what you observe in Britain. Even as late as 1840, French road density was about 50% that in Britain. And Shostak's analysis suggests that the poor transportation density in France was something that actually slowed its industrial growth, because it was really difficult to bring raw materials to the place where they needed to be used, particularly things like iron ore or coal in the 18th and early 19th century. If we move on and look at other forms of infrastructure, the railway system, Britain was the first beginning to build railways in a sort of railway craze in the 1830s, but it was the market that actually provided the entrepreneurship, provided the finance, provided the technology, took the risks. A lot of the early railway companies went bust. What the state did, and it did do something, was that it provided the property rights and it provided the regulatory coordination to make the railway system, the different railway companies coordinate their standards. On the continent, France and Germany followed later, and mainly via state provision. In fact, I was surprised to read something a few weeks ago that pointed out that the different railway systems in Germany didn't actually coordinate nationally until after 1914, even though German unification had happened in 1870. So you would expect there to have been some national coordination. That role of the state didn't happen until after 1914. I think the story is really that overall, European states did very, very little to provide transportation infrastructure before about 1850. And in England and mainly the southern Netherlands, what's now Belgium and Luxembourg, the state at least provided the property rights guarantees and the regulatory framework, but it was still the market that built the infrastructure and bore the risks. So that small proportion of state spending that was allocated to civilian purposes, it wasn't really being devoted to providing transportation infrastructure. What about legal capacity? Well, that's another thing where we think legal capacity can aid economic growth by ensuring personal security, security of persons, making merchants, long-distance merchants feel that it's safe to go and trade, or even short-distance businessmen feel that it's actually something that they can move from place to place. With personal security, the state provides property rights and the state provides contract enforcement. So legal capacity is something that we think is really important for economic growth. Historically, though, the state did not actually fund the legal system. The vast majority of law courts were funded by fees paid by the litigants. So the whole legal infrastructure, it wasn't funded by the state. So that very small proportion of state expenditure that went on civilian purposes was not being used to pay for legal capacity. The state did provide legitimacy and enforcement. So it played its role in sort of providing the public goods of legitimacy and enforcement, but it didn't actually fund the legal system. The other thing to recognize is that not all legal capacity benefits growth. It depends on the content of the law. We take for granted now, I think, that the rule of law is basically good, and that the more of it we have, the better for the economy and for us personally. But imagine a legal system, which you should imagine for the European past, and which you will not have too much difficulty in imagining for some parts of poorer countries. Now, if the law legislates harmful economic policies, a state with high legal capacity can actually enforce those policies very effectively. And if you look at the sad economic history of some of the parts of Europe that experienced very slow economic growth until the early to mid 19th century, you will see what happens when you've got a legal system which has bad content of the laws rather than good ones. Just to give a couple of examples, to set up a factory in 18th or 19th century Germany or Spain, and indeed in many other parts of the European continent at that time, required you to get a so-called concession. And that was a legal privilege, if you like. And the high capacity of the German and Spanish legal systems was actually used to grant and enforce these exclusive concessions. So you could not just go and set up a factory in your backyard. You had to get a state license to do that. And as soon as you had to apply for the license, it opened up a lot of room for rent seeking and for people who thought that your factory was going to compete with something they were doing already to lobby against you being granted the concession. And in fact, that was something which delayed the foundation of the very first English-style textile factory in Germany, which a guy called Brüggelmann tried to set up in the Wuppertal in the late 18th century, and he couldn't get the concession. In the end, he actually had to move to a different state to set it up because he wasn't able, the counter lobbying, the rent seeking, using completely legal lines of resistance prevented him from setting up this first factory in Germany. Another example, which comes out of my own recent work, a book I published in 2019 on the European guilds. Many European states granted legal privileges to guilds and business cartels, which extracted rents by limiting entry and raising prices. And the high legal capacity of many European states was actually used to enforce those monopolistic privileges, which benefited small groups of businessmen, but were bad for consumers, bad for employees, and of course inflicted deadweight losses on the whole economy. I think the general lesson is the rule of law can benefit economic growth very much, but only if the law is growth friendly, or at least neutral. It isn't growth hostile. The rule of law is an extremely important thing the state can do, but we shouldn't assume that the legal system will do that. We actually have to put more attention into designing a legal system that will be good for economic growth. What about bureaucratic capacity? Well, bureaucratic capacity can aid economic growth by ensuring that you get both competent and impartial, even implementation of state policy. But the effects of bureaucratic capacity depend, of course, on what your bureaucrats do. China is legendary for having very high bureaucratic capacity, and I don't just mean in terms of quantity, but also in terms of quality. China had a meritocratic set of civil service exams going back into medieval times. So it had very, very high quality of the bureaucracy as well as quantity, but very low economic growth. In fact, in China, per capita GDP declined from 1690 to 1840. And if you look at the estimates after 1840, between 1840 and 1912, it just kind of stagnated around a very low level. Within Europe as well, the earliest and best bureaucracies, and I mean highly educated, impartial bureaucracies, were found in the Scandinavian countries and in the German states. But these bureaucracies implemented administrative privileges for rent-seeking groups very often, and as we saw earlier, economic growth remained slow, and industrialization took place relatively late in the mid to late 19th century. Conversely, what we observe in England, and it seems completely counterintuitive, fast-growing England, as Brewer showed, had a tiny bureaucracy. Most of it was outward facing, so it was the excise, it was to some extent the customs bureaucracy, but internally, the English economy relied primarily on unpaid local JPs until the 19th century. This is a question not just of looking at particular examples like England. You could say, well, England was strange. England saw the first industrial revolution. Maybe we shouldn't be taking it as a counterexample. Maybe even France and Spain and Germany, they had their own particular histories. But recent cross-country analysis covering the period from 1789 to 1999 by Cornell et al. Found they coded the size and the quality of the bureaucracy in a number of different ways, and they found that it had a small and statistically insignificant effect on economic growth until 1945. Everything changed after 1945. You do see the relationship then, but not until then. And that their interpretation is that actually economic growth improved bureaucracy rather than vice versa. Finally, industrial policy. It's sometimes argued that state industrial policy was good for European economic growth, and even that it aided growth in Britain. And there are several examples which are often mentioned. In 1337, Edward III is regarded as having been a sort of proto-mercantilist who supported the cloth trade in various ways. And then in the 1490s, Henry VII came in, and it's argued that he, benefited the woolen industry by granting various forms of, again, proto-mercantilist protections. Or in 1721, the Calico Act, a trade ban on importing particular types of cotton, are supposed to have aided the British cotton industry. In fact, economic historians have looked at these rather carefully and basically debunked them all. So Edward III was he was trying to solve his fiscal problems by selling a monopoly over the wool trade to a bunch of big merchants, and it was absolutely hated by taxpayers, by wool growers, by smaller merchants. It was basically a sort of sewn up deal whereby Edward III got what he wanted in terms of revenues by granting a monopoly to a bunch of big merchants. It didn't last for very long anyway. It was just something that took place for a year or so and then stopped. Henry VII's policy similarly only lasted for 3 years, 1493 to 6. There was no discontinuity in the growth of the woolen industry, and cloth exports remained a very tiny share of English GDP. And similarly, historians of the 18th century British economy argued that the Calico Acts played absolutely no role in the later success of English cotton. So certainly in England, there was no evidence that industrial policy did any good. In fact, what happens is when you look back across the long span of European economic history, you see that all European states pursued industrial policies, many of them very like the ones of Edward III or Henry VII or the Calico Acts, yet most of them failed to develop. Not only did the industries that were being protected not develop, but of course, as we saw earlier, the economies of these countries failed to experience economic growth until after the turn into the 19th century. Give you a couple of examples. Portugal set up more than 300. In fact, I think it's been counted. The census of royal manufactories comes out at 305 royal manufactories in Portugal during the 18th century, which were granted subsidies and monopolies and import protection. Problem was they were founded with the wrong scale. It was usually far too high, far too large. They had very high costs. They charged very high prices, even when they were granted monopolies over particular markets, and they went bankrupt. None of them survived the end of the 18th century. Another example is Prussia, which had many royal textile manufactories in the 18th century, whose failure was so notorious that the Comte de Mirabeau wrote of a set of successful non-state industries in Krefeld. Unhappy those manufacturers, he wrote, if ever a Prussian king should love them. So his view was the dead hand of the Prussian king had been harmful to the royal textile manufactories, and Krefeld was lucky not to have had it. Overall, I think compared to the rest of Europe, industrial policy in Britain was very weak. It was pretty weedy, basically, And that was mainly because bureaucratic capacity in Britain was low until the 19th century, as Brewer's book showed. And unless you have good bureaucratic capacity, it's really difficult to implement an industrial policy. The question is whether that's bad or good, but certainly British industrial policy was pretty weedy by European standards. And it is universally agreed that the first industrial revolution, the British industrial revolution, didn't result from state industrial policy. Well, just to wrap up now, why should we be cautious about the concept of state capacity? As I said at the beginning, it isn't because the state can't play a role in economic growth. There are recognized things which states can do. The question is whether looking at it in terms of the capacity of the state, and in particular the fiscal capacity, but also, as I've argued, even the legal and bureaucratic capacity, whether looking at capacity is the right way to look at the role of the state in economic growth. And I think the problem is that the concept of state capacity is quite a muddled one. Anything good that states do or have done over the past 400 or 500 years tends to be called state capacity, even imposing constitutional limits on the state, because one of the things that's come out of the state capacity literature is that those states in which state capacity worked out well for the economy were actually ones where there were constitutional limits, parliamentary limits on what the state could do. But that's called state capacity. And you begin to think, well, hang on, that's a limit on the capacity of the state to implement its policies. So anything good that states do is called state capacity, even imposing constitutional limits. And then anything bad that states do is called low state capacity, even if it achieves the aims of the state and actually increases state power. I think once you start looking at the historical record, what you see is that some states did use their capacity to support growth by providing public goods, albeit rather minimal public goods, guaranteeing that the legal system would ultimately have the state behind it would be a good example, ensuring that there were secure property rights and guaranteeing contract enforcement, guaranteeing personal security, and solving market failures sometimes. There were states that actually would observe, they would take into account consumer or worker complaints about monopolies enjoyed by a bunch of powerful businessmen and would break them down. So some states did use their capacity to support growth by providing public goods and solving market failures. Others, though, as we have seen, used their capacity to fight wars and to grant favors to special interests. And none of them, sadly, were any good at picking industrial winners. And I think the long and often rather grim history of state capacity in Europe over the last 500 years suggests that state capacity was often used in ways that harmed the economy. And I think that's one reason to be cautious about advocating more of it, or at least uncritically advocating more of it. What general conclusions do I think we can draw from looking at the long historical record on state capacity? Well, I think history does show that what state capacity can do to support economic growth, but sadly, it also shows what it can do to hinder growth. The first industrial revolution, the one that happened in Britain after 1760, wasn't caused by state capacity. As we saw, the British state spent 90% of its revenues on war. It had low bureaucratic capacity, and it had, frankly, weedy industrial policy. On the other hand, you see a lot of other European societies, those middle range ones that we were looking at in the graph, which developed high fiscal, legal, and bureaucratic capacity and a very active industrial policy while their economies stagnated. Historically, even European states, even the states that existed in present-day rich economies, often use their capacity in harmful ways. And for that reason, I think we do actually need much better evidence before we accept the idea that state capacity by itself causes economic growth. So I think that's a challenge for my field, for economic historians, is to get much better evidence on the subject of state capacity, and particularly on state expenditures, on what the state actually did and does in order to evaluate and nuance the concept of state capacity. And finally, I think history suggests that what an economy needs is a good state, not a capacious one. And that brings a much tougher challenge for all of us as economists and economic historians, which is, how does an economy get a good state? And sadly, I think the lesson from history is that it's more important to build a good political system, and I realize that's a tough call, build a good political system and curb rent seeking, than to give the state lots of resources which it can then waste. Thank you very much.
Thank you ever so much, Sheila. We have time for some questions, which we'll turn to in a minute. But before doing so, I want to invite Judith Prais, Sig's daughter, into the room. And I was hoping that his granddaughter may join us as well, Roshana. I hope she's there. Come on, Roshana.
I have to confess, she's not right next to me because we have a habit of setting each other off and laughing. So,
well, humour's a good thing. It's fine. But if she wants to join, it would be lovely to see. In fact, Roshana is Sig's granddaughter, and I think I had a chance earlier on today to have a look around the Institute. Perhaps take some of our books. I'm going to check a little bit later on, Judith, if I might. But Judith, I'm going to turn to Judith now for the thank you. Simply because we're online. If we're all in the same building, we could have done the thank you at the end with some drinks. But I think we'll do that now if we may. And meanwhile, if you have any questions, just submit these via the chat function as soon as you can, and I'll turn to Sheila after that. So Judith, if I could turn to you.
So thank you very much, Professor Ogilvie. You took us on a tour across countries of Europe and across centuries, and you did that all from your office in Cambridge. Now the Institute, which sponsors the event, and the physical building were very much the backdrop to my childhood and to that of my siblings. And we recall in particular, my brother, who is somewhat of an economist, describes it as a very comprehensive economic research library. But I remember it as having a big table and with big windows. And I don't know, Professor Ogilvie, if you've been to the Institute, I imagine you have, or that you will again in the future. So very good. So I'm reminiscing for all of us, because I know a lot of us are not in the building right now. I also remember a kitchen with red and white tiles, and also is it Strutton Ground Market,
yes,
that
yes.
My father used to bring past their expiry date crates of biscuits from. And these memories endure, but remarkably so do all of these places. And that brings us great pleasure. And what I've noticed is that many of the places and institutions that my father has on his CV, he shares with Professor Ogilvie. I noticed as Cambridge and Chicago, the British Academy, various places in Germany, and of course the Institute. And so we find ourselves connected over the decades and over the centuries by shared experiences and economic processes. These lectures, they really bring together and synthesize the past with the present, and very poignantly for us as a family. And we're extremely grateful to the speaker and to the Institute for their time and for fascinating talk and for this experience, which gives so much to us as a family, and I hope also for the Institute. So thank you very much, Professor Ogilvie, and to the Institute.
Thank you ever so much, Judith, the Prais family, who I always enjoy meeting, and I hope next year, if not before, we can break bread together. That would be a great pleasure for me. Please give my regards to Roshana. Get her on the screen if you can.
I'll bring her on.
Yeah, we're can I go to some questions in a minute? But I wonder if I could maybe kick off the question, Sheila. Just listening to you, with as ever with great interest. I'm sort of thinking about the word capacity, and clearly capacity of the public sector is something that's been a very live issue in the last year and a half. Capacity has a lot of associations about it, does it? Do we mean ability, do we mean effectiveness? And I think that's something you were teasing out in your conversation. And I think in the end, I was thinking of an alternate word, which is not for me to rewrite your lecture, but I wonder if we're talking about statecraft, the ability of the state to bring about better outcomes. And the middle of statecraft, and you came to it right at the end of your lecture, is not only the political process, but the role of democracy in all that. And I apologize for my view is a little bit crass, but we have some view out there that democracy should be about transferring either the will of the people or the preferences of the people through its delegated representatives, a function of choice over what the state does over time and across, from year to year, but also in any one year, allocating resources in particular and holding those decisions to task. Because you've got democracy on one hand, and then you have another set of things about the institutions that we write down, the quality of those institutions, and whether they're able to carry out things that the market itself is not able to provide as a result of some market failure. And I wonder, is that something that those ideas are ones that you might develop furthermore or further in literature? Perhaps there are things that you could point to for us to read on those questions as well. Sheila.
I think you're absolutely right. And I wouldn't want my lecture to be interpreted as somehow arguing that there isn't a role for the state. It's more, we should probably look at the quality of decision-making, of public decision-making, rather than simply the quantity of resources that go into the state. And obviously, once we're happy with the quality of decision-making that's going on, then thinking about putting a lot of resources into making sure that those decisions can actually be implemented is extremely important. But when you've got a state which is not providing, and for whatever reason is not providing public health measures, or is not providing education, or is not providing famine relief or welfare measures, probably the priority is asking yourself, what is the problem here that the state is not doing those things which we think of as being the major role that the state has, where it's very difficult for individuals transacting in markets to take into account the externalities, to take into account the social benefits of undertaking particular decisions. And I think that is something, I mean, what I was trying to do was in a way to shift the balance and say, first, we have to understand why it is that particular states were gradually able to identify those things that the state did well and those things that the state probably should not do, like founding 305 royal manufactories. And then, having identified what the good things are that the state can do, then put state capacity into that. And I think that that's something which has arisen very strongly over the last nearly 2 years with the pandemic, because that is a situation in which individuals just looking at their own private benefit may not take into account the spillover consequences of breaking quarantine or not getting vaccinated or not engaging in social distancing and so on. And it's there that you want a coordinating mechanism. And the interesting thing is, and that's really something I'm very interested in doing research on and have been doing research on in the last 15 months or so, because you can't live through a pandemic as a medieval and early modern historian without thinking about the Black Death and the Great Plague and so on. And you start thinking, okay, how did economies deal with this public good, these externalities in the past? And the interesting thing is that even medieval and early modern economies had, some states developed actually quite good forms of quarantining and social distancing. And understanding the political deal behind developing that sort of public health policy, first in the North Italian city-states after the Black Death, but then by the 17th century, what you see in England is a sort of cooperation between community-level public health, but the state coming in and supporting that and enabling public health to go beyond the boundaries of the community and also enabling very poor communities to pay individuals to stay at home rather than going out and giving the plague to other people. You see that happening and you think there's something good going on there. Medieval and early modern states were capable of taking public action. And I think doing research into that would be something which economic historians can do much more of, where you could actually draw good lessons for the present from history by looking at how that worked out in particular parts of Europe.
Yeah, there's a set of fascinating examples there. I want to turn to a couple of questions that have come in. We have Chris Lewin, who's asking, and I'm going to read this out because it's going to be hard necessarily to bring him in, and I apologise, Chris, for not bringing you in to ask your question directly. The question is, what is the historical evidence about regulation by the state which is intended to make markets operate more effectively? But as I'm trying to think, is that I guess that's part of the statecraft that we're talking about, or state capacity. So it's not part of the measures of fiscal expenditure or anything else, but it actually bits of legislation introduced to try and increase competition or welfare. And just obviously you can't go through all the evidence, but just as you did with the response to the plague, perhaps there's one or two examples you may wish to.
One example that is top in my mind is, of course, public health policy in the late medieval and early modern period. But perhaps another nice example would be legislation, regulation governing products quality, protecting consumers, because traditionally the way that was done, not just in Europe, but in medieval Europe, but worldwide, was by professional associations. So guilds would do it. And in fact, that was one of their excuses for existing was, if you didn't have a baker's guild, then all of the bread would have, grit in it and so on. And the interesting thing is that from the 13th century on, you see the state in certain parts of Europe saying, the problem with having the producers only regulating themselves is that they will have bad incentives to do that. And we actually either need to set up something which is where you've got officials of the state checking on the guild foreman, or you actually have a state quality regulation system. And in my 2019 book on the European guilds, one of the chapters, chapter 6, I actually trace how in different parts of Europe at different times between the 13th and the 19th century, you see this very gradual and uneven transition from letting quality regulation be in the hands of the producers, who are obviously going to do some of it, but they're also going to not want to prosecute their own members, to going over first into the hands of the town governments and then into the hands of the state. And the state trying to leverage knowledge from the producers, but also impose a sort of impartial regulation. And so I think, that would be a really good answer to Chris's question, is that regulation by the state made markets operate much more effectively, in a way solved the market for lemons problem by taking quality regulation out of the hands of professional organizations. However admirable they may have made the case that they were needed, but actually it was better when the state did it.
Yeah, there's a live debate today about self-regulation or that by the state. Thinking particularly of, I won't mention industries, but it clearly hasn't gone away, that question. Really interesting question from Michaela Avecchi, who's asking, can you think of expenditure on wars as a form of industrial policy, given that kind of expenditure may have helped the development of particular industries over time? So is that one way of thinking about expenditure on wars?
That is something which historians have gone into a lot, because we tend to think from the 20th century that there was a sort of military industrial complex, and that there were particular industries, heavy industries, that did really well out of war. I think that for the past, almost all of the examples which have been investigated have come out neutral or negative, in the sense that either the industries that benefited were not really a large part even of the manufacturing sector, let alone of the economy at large. Textile industries were the ones that drove the Industrial Revolution, and the military market for textiles was just not that important. There are probably particular individual sectors. There were gun makers in northern Italy who benefited from North Italian wars, and it might be argued. I don't think the German economic historians have really come to the conclusion that war in 19th century Germany was really important for the industrial sector, but German industrialization was much more heavy industrial type of industrial revolution. So you might be able to make a better argument there. But again, it's something which economic historians have looked at a lot, and we just haven't found evidence that having war, it might have stimulated one or two industries, but the costs were so incredible that they outweighed any possible benefit to these tiny heavy industry sectors.
Thank you, Sheila. I've got to say, you can't see all of this, but we're getting, I'm not very good at social media, but as far as I can see, we're getting a lot of likes. Everyone has been absolutely fascinated by the talk, and they're all starting off with many thank yous. I'm going to combine two questions into one, if I might, for the sake of time. We're running out of time now. Paul Mortimer-Lee and Anastasia Matsakudu really asking a similar kind of question. Paul is asking whether, and compared to China, is there any evidence to suggest that decentralization decision-making is superior to centralization? And there's a question about whether decentralization helped industrialization in Britain, in the sense in which it was a time that the North did relatively well. And that leads to questions about competition between regions, and which is a germane question right now because of the levelling up agenda. And I think it's a similar kind of question from Anastasia, which is, would you say that the sophistication or autonomy of state bureaucracies, rather than competition, in the East Asian countries had any effect on those countries' economic growth? So I think they're both questions about the appropriate size of the state and its capacity. And you yourself mentioned that the centralization or the bureaucratic ability of the Chinese state. So I kind of wonder, it's probably not possible to have a universal rule, I imagine. It depends, unfortunately, is the answer. But please, Sheila, how would you respond to it?
There's been a lot of fantastic work done in the last 5 or 10 years on state capacity in China. And I think Chinese economic history is, in a way, the new frontier, and it's just being opened up in an incredible way. And a lot of it focuses on this question of whether China actually lacked state capacity to the extent that it might seem if you just focus on what the center did. Because the local government level in China was really responsible for a lot of activities and actually engaged in a lot of famine relief, which is something that European states almost never did. So there are all sorts of civilian expenditures which you observe in China, particularly on the local level. And so I think that that's the way in which Chinese state capacity studies are going. I think, though, there is always a danger to devolution, if you like, in the sense that if devolving state power to the locality puts it in the hands of a self-perpetuating elite that simply uses its political power to extract more from the peasants and not to build irrigation systems or, engage in famine relief or whatever, then you're actually going to get a situation that's much more like Eastern Central Europe, like Prussia or the Bohemian lands, or Russia in the 16th through 18th centuries, where you've got really strong devolution, but it's all being, going into the hands of huge local landlords who don't do anything good in terms of public goods. So again, it's really a question of what are the incentives of the devolved government? And if the incentives are the way they were in Eastern Europe under the second serfdom, I think devolution was terrible for 16th, 17th, and 18th century, the Czech lands and Pomerania and so on. But it sounds from my Chinese colleagues as if there were at least regions in China where the local governments were very beneficent and were, they were levying almost sometimes as much taxes as the center, but they were actually using it for local good, especially in famine situations, and maybe they knew more about local circumstances than the center did. And that's one benefit of having devolution. But again, how you design the devolved powers is going to make all the difference.
Well, I think that must be right. Design, statecraft, capacity, and just thinking really hard, collecting evidence. There's a lot for us to think about on the back of what's been a wonderful talk. I want to thank the Prais family, in particular Judith and Roshana, for joining us this evening. I know you're representatives of the family. I've had a few messages from other members this evening as well, so it's lovely to hear from them again. Particularly, may I thank Sheila Ogu for such a stimulating lecture. Very nice to have the chance to catch up again. All the team at NISA for putting this on. I think this is recorded and will go out for people to watch, but also we'll have a chance to read your work as we move on and think about these issues. The question of state capacity is critical, as I said right at the beginning. It's something I think that has been exposed by the various crises the UK has been through in the last decade or so. And I think there is a moment as we come out of COVID to rethink our own state capacity and effectiveness and our statecraft in what we do in this country. So I look forward to drawing upon the lessons in the conversations that we have at the National Institute with those around us in Whitehall and elsewhere. Thank you, Sheila, very much for joining us this evening. And thank you for everyone for joining us online. See you all very soon. Some event.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Sheila. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. We just leave and we'll catch up again soon. I'll come and see you.
That sounds good. Great.
You
Enjoy
take care.
your evening. Thanks again for the invitation. Bye-bye.
Absolutely lovely to see you, Sheila. You take care.
Lovely to see you. Bye-bye.